Yo, what's up? Welcome back to Groovy Selective. Today we're going to be remaking On and On by Chris Lake. If you would like to support me or you want to level up your production game, you can find all of my sample and serum 2 packs in the link below. Okay, we're going to jump straight in and we're going to be looking at the chords to start with. Now, the key of the track is E flat Dorian, and we're starting off with E flat minor. The notes are A sharp, D sharp, F sharp. And for the next chord, G flat major. So C sharp, F sharp, A sharp. And the final chord in our drop is B flat minor 7. So we've got A sharp, C sharp, F, and G sharp. And I've got 2 presets for the pad. Now, starting with big chords, you're going to start off with 2 sawtooth waves. And that's going to be on oscillator A and oscillator B. We're using basic shapes. The unison on oscillator A is set to 16. The unison on oscillator B is set to 4. And then we've got the wavetable positions both set to position 2, which is the saw wave. Our detune is set to 0.18 on oscillator A and 0.1 on oscillator B. And then for our sub-oscillator, we just have a square wave. And for our noise oscillator, we're using AC hum, which is in organics. And then I have MG Low 12 as our filter. That is controlling the cutoff for the sub, oscillator A, B, and the noise. And then I'm using LFO1 to slowly open up the filter in the drop. Looking at envelope 1, our attack is set to 0.5, our decay time is set to 1 second, and our release time is set to 15 milliseconds. Make sure you keep the sustain maxed out, and our hold is just set to 0. Now we're going to look at the effects. So we have a delay. The mix is set to 58%. Our left and right, which is set to ping pong, is set to 8th note dotted. And then the feedback is set to 71%. For the reverb, we've set the wet to 40%. The size is at 73%. And our decay 1.5 seconds. Moving on to the next sound. On oscillator A, we have a sawtooth wavetable. And then we've set the unison to 8. The detune is set to 0.1. And then the noise, we're using alpha noise, which is the first one in analog. And then our envelope is set to default. Now I've got LFO2 controlling up my cutoff filter, which is affecting oscillator A and the noise oscillator. And then if we go over to our effects, we've got a reverb. The mix is set to 64%. The decay time is 1.1 seconds. And the size is set to 35%. And then I'm just cutting off the lows on this pad. Now, these are both fairly simple sounds. However, you can find them both in the Groovy Selective packs down below. And in context of the mix so far, it should sound a little bit like this. Moving on to the lead sound, I'm using one of the sounds from the pack, which is Cheeky Pluck lead. Now, if I look at the MIDI, the melody revolves around the A sharp, and then it goes up to C sharp, and then down to C. And then we're going to look at the sound design of the lead. So I'm going to pull up Serum, and for wavetable A, we're using a triangle wave, and then I've set the warp to PWM. We've turned this to 88%, and we can see how this affects our wavetable. And then if we go to oscillator B, we're using basic shapes, we're using a square wave. I've set the unison to 2. The detune is set to 0.06. And moving on to the noise oscillator, we're using AC hum 1. And then we're using a filter on oscillator A and oscillator B. And then looking at envelope 1, we've set the attack to 0.3 milliseconds. The hold is set to 0. The decay is 1 second. The sustain is set to minus 6.8 dB. And the release time is set to 229. Now I'm using envelope 2 to control our cutoff filter and the level of the noise oscillator, and our attack is set to 3 milliseconds. Our decay time is set to 793 milliseconds, the sustain is at 66%, and the release time is at 229 milliseconds. Moving on to our effects, I'm using a distortion, we're using the tube preset, the drive is set to 66%, and the mix is set to 100. And then I've got hyper dimensions. So for the hyper module, I've set the mix to 32%. The detune is set to 25, and the rate is set to 40. And then looking at dimension, the size is set to 33%, and the mix is set to 40. And then I'm using a chorus just to add a little bit of extra width. And then I've got a reverb, and the mix is set to 16%. Decay is set to 1.3 seconds, and the size is set to 11%. And then we're using an EQ just to cut out all of that low end energy. And in context of the mix, it should sound a little bit like this. And I've got one more pluck layer. So if we go into Serum, and for oscillator A, we're using the basic MCB. And then I've used our warp option here. I've selected bend, and we can see again how this shapes our wavetable. Set this to around 50%, and then you're going to load up basic mini on oscillator B. Set the unison to 2, which will create some more stereo width. The detune is set to 0.01, and then on the noise oscillator, we're using white noise. For filter 1, we've assigned that to oscillator A, B, and noise. And then moving over to envelope 1, we've assigned this to our cutoff filter, and we've set the attack to 8.6 milliseconds, 479 milliseconds for decay. Turn your sustain all the way down, and then your release time should be around 300 milliseconds. Now I'm also using LFO1 to control the opposite side of the cutoff filter. Now, moving into our effects, I've got distortion, we're using tape saturation, the drive is set to 44%, and the mix is set to 60. And then we're using the hyperdimension module again, and I'm only using the dimension module, which is set to 12% mix, and the size is set to 0. And then I have a delay, but I've actually turned it off in this instance for this layer because I didn't want it to get cloudy in the mix. I was trying to reflect what happened in the original. And then we're looking at our reverb. So the mix is set to 25% and our size is set to 31% with a decay time of 24%. And then we've set this to vintage. And then again, we've got an EQ at the bottom, and that is just cutting out all of that low end content. And we're just using that as a layer. For our next lead sound, I have just duplicated the cheeky plucky lead. However, I've just turned the attack up. And then if we move over to our last lead layer, I'm using the Here Right Now preset. And oscillator A is set to a sawtooth. Oscillator B is set to basic MG. And then the unison on oscillator A is set to 6. And the detune is set to 0.09. If we look at envelope 1, we've set the attack to 4.5 milliseconds, decay time to 1 second, our sustain is left at 0 dB, and our release time is set to 184 milliseconds. And now I'm using envelope 2 to control the cutoff filter, and the attack is set to 45 milliseconds, the decay time is set to 504 milliseconds, and the release time is set to 101. Just make sure you turn down your sustain. Moving on to the effects for this sound, I'm using an EQ to cut out all the lows and boost some of the highs. I'm using a distortion to add a little bit of saturation. We're using the soft clipper, and then I've turned the drive up to 92%, and then the mix level is set to 27. And then I'm using a compressor to bring out some of the highs and the lows. And then I've got a reverb that is set to Hall, and our size is set to 35%, and the decay time is set to 4.4 seconds. And then the mix is set to 20. And in context of the mix, it should sound a little bit like this. So looking at our first bass sound, we're using Reese 1, and I'm going to go to oscillator A, which is set to basic MDC. We've turned this down by 1 octave, and it's set to a sawtooth wave. For oscillator B, we're using the basic mini, and this is set down by 1 octave. And then we're using filter 1 and assigned this to oscillator A and B, and the cutoff is set to 180 Hertz. I've kept envelope 1 at default, and then envelope 2 is controlling our cutoff filter, and the attack is set to 13 milliseconds. The decay time is set to 1 millisecond, and the release time is set to 15. Make sure you turn your sustain all the way down. One more thing to mention about the filter, we have turned key tracking on, so as we move around on the keyboard, it is going to affect our filter in a slightly different way. Now, we're going to go over to our effects. It's a fairly simple and straightforward sound. We're using a soft clipper, and we've turned the drive up to 37% and the mix at 100%. And then I'm just using a compressor just to control those dynamics just a little bit. And finally, our last bass sound. All three of our wavetables here are set to a sine wave. I have altered the phase on the oscillator B, so we've set that to 248 degrees. And then we're using the warp function and set this to PDB, and we're going to turn this up to 28%. Envelope 1 is set to 3.1 milliseconds, the decay time set to 1 millisecond, the sustain can be left at 0, and the release time is set to 163. And then I'm using envelope 2 to control warp, and our attack is set to 3 milliseconds, our decay time is set to 338 milliseconds, and our release time is set to 15 milliseconds. And then moving on to envelope 3, this is controlling our level and our coarse pitch. And set your attack to 0 milliseconds, your decay time to 18 milliseconds, and your release time to 15 milliseconds. Moving over to the effects, I've got a distortion, I'm using the soft clipper, the drive is set to 82%, and the mix is set to 20. And then we're using a chorus just to make it a little bit wider, and that is set to 22%, and the rate is set to 0.08 hertz. And then I'm using a compressor to control the dynamics, remove some of the high-end content, boost the mids, and boost the lows. And the mix is set to 100%. And in context, it should sound a little bit like this. Now, Chris Lake loves his syncopated bass lines. If we look at the notation, he's starting off on D sharp, he's moving to F, then F sharp, back down to F, up to A sharp, and then resolving on the F. Now, moving on to the chord progression for the build-up, we're starting off with E flat minor 7, so D sharp, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp. Then we've got F minor 7, so F, G sharp, C, D sharp. Then G flat major 7, so F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, F. Then back to F minor 7, so F, G sharp, C, D sharp. And then B flat minor 7, so that's A sharp, C sharp, F, G sharp. And we're resolving on the D flat major 7, so C sharp, F, G sharp, C. In context, it sounds a little bit like this. So the lead line is just up an octave, and then I've just copied the bass line over into the build-up, and now we can move on to the drums. So we're going to start off with finding a kick in the Groove Selective pack. Now, Chris Lake uses quite punchy kicks, and that dominates a lot of the mix, so I'm going to use kick 3, and now we're going to find our clap. I'm going to use clap 5, and now we need to find an open hi-hat. I'm going to use open hat 1, and I'm going to use open hat 2. I'm going to use closed hat 1, and then I'm going to pull all of my samples into the drum machine designer. And as with a lot of house music, the kick is always going to be landing on the 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the most part. The clap's going to be on the 2 and 4. We've got the open hi-hats landing on the offbeat, and that's going to create syncopation. I'm just going to use the closed hat on the strong beats, so 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then you're going to duplicate this MIDI, and then now we need to work on our build-up drums. What I noticed listening to the original, the kicks are going to be landing on 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then it's just got an open hi-hat on the offbeat. And then we're going to duplicate these regions. And we're going to use an EQ to cut off all of that bottom end. And then I'm going to automate. So I'm going to press A, and I'm going to automate the low cut frequency to drop out when our drop kicks in, so we have all that low end information. And then I'm also going to go to our high shelf frequency and automate that so we get all of our top end information back. And now we need to find a snare drum. So again, going into the pack, I'm going to go into our snares. I'm going to select snare 3. We're going to pull this into our quick sampler. I'm going to right click. I'm going to create a pattern region. And I'm going to create 16th notes. Once I've done this, I'm going to convert this to a MIDI region so I have more control. I'm going to select all of our MIDI. I'm going to go to Functions, MIDI Transform, randomize the velocity, and that's just going to make it sound a little less robotic. I'm going to hit Operate Only, so I've set my bottom value to 116 and the top value to 127. And then we're going to go over to 16th note, time quantize, select the swing function and turn this up to about 54%. And we'll notice our notes are now off the grid and all the velocities have changed ever so slightly. And then we're going to go back to our build up and we're going to have the snares come in halfway and we're going to filter these in. So we're going to start off by cutting out all of that top end. We're going to press A, we're going to go to our high cut frequency, and then we're going to open up the filter. So we're starting around 500 Hertz, and then it's going to move all the way up to 20K. So now we're going to move on to some effects, and I'm just going to put in a riser and a downlifter. So I'm going to go into our Groove Selective pack, I'm going to go to Effects, I'm going to find a downlifter. So I'm going to use downlifter 6, and then I'm going to use riser 3. And we need to make sure this aligns with our grids towards the end of the build-up. Turn these down in the mix. Our final effect is actually not necessarily an effect, but it's going to be a drum fill, and this is going to happen just before the drop. So you'll notice I've extended the drum fill to go in between bar 34 and bar 35 here. And then there's just a small fill that fills this gap between for this last half of the bar. So I'm actually going to duplicate my drums here. I'm going to right click, I'm going to create a MIDI region, and we're just going to set this to half of the bar. There's 2 claps at play, and then you've got some percussion hits in between. So I'm going to go back into our Groove Selective pack, and I'm going to find a percussion hit. I'm going to use perk 3, and I'm going to pull this over to our quick sampler. I'm going just to create some filler notes in between our 2 claps. I'm going to turn the velocity all the way down. I don't want them to be too aggressive. And everything in context of the mix should sound a little bit like this. So that wraps up today's video. Thank you for tuning in. If you do like any of the sounds that you hear in any of my videos, drop by the link down below. You can find a link to all of my sample packs there, and you can make use of these sounds, or you can recreate them with me in these videos.